They want to go and look for themselves first and find out what they're going to have to tell people before they do the public one. And I just think that's a consistent pattern that seems to be happening with NASA on a fairly regular basis. Well, we weren't going to get any pictures of Sidonia or the face anytime soon, so Richard and his colleagues started to turn their attention to the moon, which seems like a good place because it doesn't make any sense for people to have come to this solar system, come to Earth possibly, and gone to Mars and built these artifacts, built these huge monuments, these huge structures, and not also come to the Earth or come to the moon. So they begin to look at images of the moon. This is one of the first things that Richard found, which is in an area called Sinus Medii, which is literally called the sea in the middle. And so that was the first place he looked. And what he found was, at the very edges of some of this, was a couple of odd-looking things. This right here is actually a camera registration mark. That's not anything specific. But this guy right here is a pillar about 1.5 miles tall. You can see that it's casting a shadow on the lunar surface. The shadows are consistent with where the sun was from the perspective of the spacecraft at this time, which is Lunar Orbiter. And there's also this weird fuzzy thing in the background. Well, what these two objects were later dubbed was the Shard and the Tower. And because this has been out there for so long, I didn't include any more pictures of these things, but they're in the book and they're also available for free on our website on enterprisemission.com. And they appear to be glass structures or made of glass-like material, see-through stuff. They were reflecting light in a very consistent geometric pattern, and basically it got him started on the idea that, hey, there might be some kind of ruins on the moon as well. Here's another object, which I just, you know, Richard doesn't think much of this image. I had to fight to get it included in Dark Mission. I look at this thing and I think, okay, again, this is a NASA photo. We have done nothing to this except enlarge it and point out that there's a huge paperclip on the moon somewhere. Now that thing is, it looks like a bent paperclip, and it's obviously some kind of antenna, and there's a series of pictures as they're going along, and what happens is because these things are transparent, made of some sort of glass, it seems like that just when the sun and the camera get aligned just perfectly, that's when you see these things, and then the next frame they disappear. But, I mean, that's some sort of pillar or tower. Again, it's probably, I don't know, 70, 80 stories tall, and there's this big wire antenna or something wrapped around it. Now that thing is really there. It's really on the picture. You can go to any NASA archive and pull this image, and I forget the image number, but again, it's in the book. And you can pull this thing out and see that it's there. So the question is, okay, you're telling me there's nothing on the moon, yet what's that? Because it sure isn't a crater. It isn't, you know, a rock. It's something really weird. Now, the area that was found in, we dubbed, or was named Los Angeles, because it was about the size of the Los Angeles basin. It had this crisscrossing geometric pattern. And this was some images we found right before we published Dark Mission, just last summer. And it's the 4600 series. And again, you have this sort of crisscrossing pattern. And you can see what looks like maybe roads and so forth going through here. And you have these very bright, reflective, sort of interconnected, I don't know, structures, towers, glass shards. Here's a close-up of one of them, and what this really reminds me of as I look at this crisscrossing pattern here, and again, it's kind of subtle and you lose a little bit of the detail on the screen, but it reminded me of this from the Superman movies, this Fortress of Solitude. It's weird, because there's no way that can be on the moon. The moon should be boring. It should be gray. It should be dark. It should be bland. And instead you've got these bright, glowing things that are reflecting sunlight, and they have to be some sort of glass. Now, before we go to the next part, well, we'll talk about this in the next part. One of the things that happened is when Richard went around the country and started lecturing on this stuff is he met a guy named Ken Johnston. Now, Ken used to work for NASA. He was a contractor with Grumman, and he taught all of the astronauts to fly the lunar module. That was his main thing, was astronaut training. After that part of the mission was over, he went to the Lunar Receiving Laboratory where he was in charge of cataloging all the samples. And he had to take all the rock samples, compare them with pictures that had been taken of the samples, because their process was supposed to be, we're going to take a picture of this rock, and then we're going to collect the rock, and we're going to put it in the bag. And in other words, that way they would know where it was. Well, as a result, he had 4 complete sets of all of the handheld photography that was taken by the Apollo astronauts on the surface of the moon, the 6 times that we went to the moon. And yes, Virginia, we did go to the moon. After a few years, he was called into the boss's office and told that NASA headquarters has ordered that you destroy all of these prints. Now, the really interesting thing about this is these were all first-generation prints. In other words, they take the pictures, they bring the negatives back, they develop them into prints, and he got them. Okay? And that made no sense. He begged, basically begged repeatedly, can I just donate these to different universities? And they said, no, destroy them. Fortunately, he had a pang or twinge of conscience, and he didn't destroy them. He kept one set. Out of that set, he picked a few pictures that he kept for himself, and he gave the rest of them to Oklahoma City University. Unfortunately, it looks like one of the professors there ran off with a lot of them. But the ones he kept, some of them are pretty interesting. Here is a section of a panorama from Apollo 14, and what this involved was Alan Shepard getting off the lunar module. The first thing he did is he took out his camera, his Hasselblad camera, and he took pictures of the horizon like this, and he got a complete look of the panorama of the landing site. Now, the thing that didn't make a lot of sense if you look at this is he got an awful lot more of the sky than he needed to. That was the first thing we noticed, is that what is he supposed to be taking pictures of the ground in front of him? Isn't that the interesting thing? When we overexposed the background, what came out again was these blue, sort of crisscrossing, weird, geometric, bright patterns in the sky. Now, contrary to what people like David Percy might tell you, there should not be any stars in the sky on any pictures taken from the lunar surface. The reason is that you don't have any atmosphere to diffuse anything. You've got very, very extremely bright surface in front of you, which is made up entirely of glass and aluminum and titanium and very bright reflective material. And the f-stops of the cameras were set to about 1/250th of a second. So there's no way you're going to get an exposure of a star that's thousands of light years away on an exposure like that. Because they had to do it that way, or they would have had the foreground completely washed out. But when we went through and overexposed these, and again, this was done both on the analog prints by normal photographic techniques and then later scanned in and also done with digital enhancement processes, we got this weird stuff that should not be there. There should be nothing there. It was pretty easy to discount that these were scratches on the negatives or anything like that, that it was just part of the aging process. There were different ways that the film was put through various levels of tests by experts, photographic experts that we hired. And again, in the book, we explain all the reasons why these things are really on these images, and they're not artifacts, they're not scratches. They're actually stuff that seems to be on the moon. The interesting thing was that as you went through this panorama, this overexposed panorama, what we saw is that you had really, really bright areas about 180 degrees apart. And in between that, it was darker. See how it's darker? There's less reflection going on there. And here as you get up sun, you see that it's very, very bright, and then again it gets darker. And then down sun, the opposite way, the opposite direction, you get it, again it gets bright again, not as bright. But that's a phenomenon called backscattering. And to have backscattering, basically what you have to have is the sun coming through something, the atmosphere or glass or something, and basically scattering light from here 180 degrees away. And what you're going to get is less and less light on the sides. So if these were photographic defects, they somehow understood how to follow the geometry of the backscattering phenomenon. So we know that there's no atmosphere on the moon. So the only other option was that there's some sort of semi-transparent or transparent medium that this light is passing through. Here's the full panorama, and again you can see, up sun, down sun are the brightest areas. In between, there's these very dark areas where there's not as much light coming through, so you're not getting as much of the background exposed. Now here's one of those frames. This is called Mitchell Under Glass, and it's kind of the common name. There's astronaut Ed Mitchell right there setting up the camera. This is AS14 669301, and we've actually found, NASA has scanned a brand new version of this from what they say are their original current negatives, and the same stuff is still there. You still get this very bizarre back and forth pattern. Now again, I understand people being skeptical about this, because what you see here is you see the stuff being very vertical, left and right, up and down, and you think, okay, that's film grain. Now, it's not film grain, but I can understand why you're skeptical. However, if you look at certain portions of this, you'll see that not all of it follows north and south and the film grain. A lot of it is actually diagonal. See this stuff here? So these look like big, huge structural supports supporting something. And this stuff right here, I'm a structural engineer. It's aerospace, but I'm not an architect, but I understand basic design. And these things are spaced exactly as they would be spaced if they were self-supporting, reinforcing bar kind of structures. Here's a super close-up. And again, as an engineer, I just immediately see engineering. Here's a couple of things that are intersecting there. And another thing I want to caution you on is that with some of these images, I see some of the reviews on Amazon, and they're like, well, the pictures don't show anything like what the guys say that they do. And there's a reason why the whole world is not engineers. And that is that about a third of the population can do 3D projection in their head. They can take a piece of paper. You know the exercises where you have a piece of paper and they show you a shape, and they say, okay, what would this look like folded over, 5 different ways? And